Good afternoon and welcome to the latest in our series of careers webinars brought to you by the HOP platform. So HOP stands for the Hertfordshire Opportunities Portal. It is a website that we hope every young person and school in Hertfordshire is aware of and using, because it's a bit of a one-stop shop to give you guidance and advice about future career options that you can take. And one of the features of the HOP website are these webinars that we run every week. And today's webinar, we are going to focus on a career as a British Sign Language interpreter. We've got a fantastic panelist with us who is going to share her experiences with you very shortly. Normally we record these live. For some technical problems I won't go into. We're doing this as a pre-record today, but exactly the same basis. This will last about 45 minutes. We will talk to Jenny about her experiences. She'll be able to give you lots of really, really important tips, advice and guidance about what you might want to do. But do familiarise yourself with the HOP platform. So have a look at some of our social media handles that you can see on the screen at the moment. This video, you're watching this on our YouTube channel. You will be able to find about 70 other webinars that we've recorded over the last few years covering a whole variety of different subjects. So in this webinar, we're going to find out, well, what does an interpreter actually do? What sorts of skills, qualities and qualifications would you need? We'll find out about the enjoyable aspects of the role and maybe some of the less enjoyable aspects of the role that it's probably important that you are aware of as well. So without any further ado, I am going to hand you over to our panelist today, Jenny, to introduce herself and tell us a little bit more about her background as an interpreter. So Jenny, we are delighted to have you with us. We have you with us today. It'd be great just to hear a little bit about you.
Thank you very much, Gareth, and thank you very much for having me and getting me to talk a little bit about my job and what I do and what my colleagues do. On that note, I might as well introduce my colleagues who you can see on the video interpreting for us. Sarah Butt, who I graduated with in the same cohort, and Dr. Christopher Stone, who they are both really very good interpreters and highly qualified interpreters, and they are doing what I do, interpret from English to BSL and the other way around, of course, as well.
Sure. Okay. So, Jenny, first of all, tell us, how did you get into this? What were your aspirations? Think back to when you were at school, maybe 15, 16 years old. Did you envisage this was going to be your career?
Yes and no. That's a little bit complicated in my case, but I think that's true maybe for many interpreters. I grew up in Germany, and I grew up in a very small village. I had an uncle who was deaf, and he was not really educated in sign language as many other deaf people are as well. So he went to an oral school where they didn't use sign language. And I always found it a shame that I couldn't communicate with him properly, and he struggled to communicate with people as well. So I started looking into learning sign language. But because I grew up in a really tiny village in Germany and very far away from the big cities, that was really difficult. I didn't know how I could learn sign language, and it was before the time of internet and Google and YouTube, really. So it took me a very long time to get to this career. I did a degree in social work first, and I did work experience in a deaf residential home. So for deaf people with additional disabilities. And I learned a little bit of sign language and got really fascinated. And then when I moved here and needed to choose a new career, I remembered that I really loved sign language. So I started learning, did a level 1 course, got hooked, and then I applied in Wolverhampton at the university for the course. And 4 years later, there I was.
Yeah. So what you've touched on there is that this was something that you did because of your own personal experiences, I guess, and wanting to communicate with your family members. Thinking about other interpreters that you know, is that common with them? Was it sort of born out of needing to communicate with a friend or a family member?
I think many of us have some connection to sign language, either when they grow up or through their work. Many will have worked in other social care areas. We have people who were previously nurses or social workers, people who have deaf friends, deaf family members. But sometimes people just get really excited, especially now. You might have seen on TV Rose Alice, sorry, I can't remember her name, the Strictly Come Dancing. She is deaf, so she used sign language on British TV very publicly, and that has caused a bit of a surge. So people who are interested in language, people who are interested in working with other people, people who are interested in a really variety of things, because interpreting happens wherever deaf people are, and deaf people are everywhere.
Sure. Okay. Well, we'll obviously delve into that a little bit further, and maybe some of your experiences as we go through. So, just a couple of questions on the screen here to act as a little bit of a prompt. So, my first question is, where do interpreters actually work? Now, we're very fortunate that we've got Christopher and Sarah with us today, because we can actually see some real life interpreters at work in front of us. The first time on any of these webinars I've been able to do something like this. But where would you find interpreters?
Everywhere, as I already kind of said, but a lot of our work is kind of in public services. So under the Equality Act, deaf people have a right to interpreting, to a BSL interpreter, to have access, particularly when it's hospitals, court, police, social services, education, all of those elements. And of course, there is a scheme called Access to Work, where deaf people can have interpreters when they are working in the workplace. So we are wherever the deaf person is, and that can be any industry, it can be any job, it can be any situation. I think the one thing I often like to say to the trainee interpreters is, we are there when a deaf person's life changes. That may be for the better or the worse. You never know that. But whenever something happens in a deaf person's life where they have contact with authorities, then an interpreter is likely to be present.
Sure. Okay. So are interpreters likely to be linked on a one-to-one basis with a particular individual and follow them and accompany them in different work environments, or is it a bit more cluster-based? Could you be matched and assigned to a variety of different people?
That both of those things can happen. So the majority of us are freelancers, so the majority are not employed in specific settings. So we might work for an agency, or we might be booked directly by a deaf person or by a hearing person. And then we might work with one individual for one day a week, and with a different individual the next day of the week. We might also do a lot of medical bookings, for example. That's how I started. I did a lot of medical bookings, which could be 4, 5, 6 bookings in one day, going to different places. It might also be that I'm in a school in the morning for a deaf person who is training to become a teacher. And in the afternoon, I go to a care home. And in the evening, I go to a gala event where I'm interpreting for a presentation or an awards ceremony or something.
Yeah. So for you personally, is having that variety a really enjoyable part of the role?
Yeah, I think it's the most enjoyable, but also not the easiest part, because you have to be organized. You have to be able to manage a diary, and not double book yourself, and turn up in the right place at the right time and make sure you have enough time to travel, because that can happen. I might have a booking, I don't know, in London one day and in Manchester the next, and in Derby the day after that, and then in 3 different areas around Derby. So you have to be able to manage those things, and you have to manage your rest time as well, because the job is not just interpreting. You do a lot of preparation work as well. If I'm interpreting for, let's say, a university lecture, then I need to read the slides beforehand. I need to know what the student is doing, but I might not have done the last 3 years of their studies. So I'm the one that comes in new to this subject, whereas the student has had it for 3 years. The same with a business meeting. I might go into a business meeting where everybody in the room knows each other, everybody knows what they're talking about. It's just me that doesn't. So my job is then to make sure that I can represent both the deaf and the hearing people appropriately in both languages.
For sure. Okay, well, that's actually a nice segue into my next question. And the clue's in the question, so it looks like sounds like a pretty silly question to ask. But BSL, is it universal?
No.
No.
In fact, so there is different sign languages in every country. There are some countries that have more than one sign language. And there's also a great variety or variation within the UK. So if you meet a deaf person from Scotland and a deaf person from London, you might, when you're first learning BSL, you might struggle to understand them because the variation is quite, can be a lot of difference in the vocabulary as well.
Sure. Okay. I'm going to come back on that, but maybe we'll come back and talk about that when we talk about qualifications and skills and backgrounds. But I want to know, what are the most enjoyable parts of the role, Jenny? And also, what are the more challenging areas of it as well?
Mm-hmm. I love the variety of it. I love that I can more or less choose what area I like to work in. So one of my, I would say, specialist areas is mental health. And as well as education. I like academia, so I do quite a lot of academic interpreting because that sits well with my skills and with what I did before and what I know. You have to imagine if you're, let's say, interpreting for mechanical engineering and you know nothing about that subject, it becomes really difficult because you don't understand the source language and then you can't translate it because you don't know what it means. But yeah, I love the fact that I can no 2 days are the same. I can do something else every day. I can pick a new area if I find I need a challenge. At the same time, of course, this can also be difficult because you might walk into something that you've never done before and it can be quite scary. And I think what's definitely needed is a lot of respect for the job because we enter aspects of deaf people's lives that can be very private. We are there at the hospital when they have an operation, when they are being examined by somebody. We are there for a funeral. We are there for their wedding, for their graduation, when they fail a test. We are there for the disciplinary at work, potentially, in the court case where they get sentenced. So I think it requires respect for the job and for other humans and other people's life choices, because they won't be necessarily be the same life choices that I would make.
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, that's really interesting. Perhaps it's not something that you'd necessarily think of as part of that role, but of course you are literally communicating everything that they need to know at any one point, which leads on to that final question I've got there, which is what are you expected to do? And it is explain everything. You mentioned around the importance of the need to learn about lots of different topics. I mean, there must be lots of, sort of local colloquialisms and and dialects that you pick up as well. So I guess from your perspective, it's just a never-ending learning cycle, isn't it? You're always learning new phrases, new ways of phrasing things.
Yes, absolutely. That is another very enjoyable part. You never stop learning, and it's amazingly interesting. I can be working in a factory on a conveyor belt where cars are being put together, and I have to learn about the names for the different car parts that I don't know. I've never heard before. Or I did see Sarah smile for just a second because we've worked together before on lots of events. Because I'm not originally from this country, my English is fine. But when there are references to comedians or a TV series
Mm.
30 years ago, I have no idea. I've never heard the names of the people. I don't know what they're talking about and why it's funny, but everybody else does. So then for me, it's very often important to have a coworker who has that background knowledge.
Yeah.
So often you work with two people, because normally we kind of say 20 minutes, half an hour. After that, your cognitive load is basically, your brain is full and you can't keep doing it
Yeah.
anymore. So you either swap, or like in our case, we have two people where one person interprets for one attendant, the other for the other participant.
Sure. Which is what we're doing right now.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Haven't noticed.
Exactly.
So Christopher is interpreting me, and Sarah is interpreting Jenny. I'm interested to just pick up on something that you mentioned there. You mentioned that Sarah would smile at something that you'd said as well. When you are interpreting, I said there's one thing interpreting the actual words that come out, but are you also thinking about interpreting how that's meant emotionally as well? Is that something you have to
Yes.
take into consideration?
Yes. So the emotions are conveyed often. That's part of the language as well. It's a little bit complicated to explain. When you start learning it, you understand it more. But basically, the adjectives that we use in English are on the face most of the time,
Okay.
on a very basic level. And also, there is a lot of background things that you would often interpret. So if there's an alarm going off in the next room, the deaf person doesn't hear that. So but the hearing people will all turn their heads. So you would obviously tell the deaf person that this is happening.
Sure.
Or if somebody is shouting, or if somebody has a very strong accent and I'm struggling to understand, then I will make that clear in my interpretation that it's me not understanding what's going on,
Yeah.
for example.
Yeah. So
And it can be also quite serious. So I don't want to scare anybody, but it can be things like interpreting somebody's last breath. That has happened
yeah.
before.
Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, of course, that's a real contrast. So you said that you could be dealing with an incredibly emotional situation and sad situation like that, and then maybe later that evening you're interpreting a comedy show where it's
Yes.
by complete contrast.
Yes.
Another thing that I'm interested in, Jenny, you've told us that German is your native tongue, and you're learning English, or you've learned English very well. Your command of the language is excellent. What are there similarities between learning a new language, a spoken language, foreign language, and this role as being a BSL interpreter? Is the functions, the process the same?
Not entirely, because it's a different modality. But generally, of course, BSL is also a language and it follows rules just like any other language does. So I think for me, I've had an education in Germany where I learned 3 other spoken languages. So when I came to BSL, it was easier maybe for me to realize, oh, so this is what the rules are of English, and this is what the rules are for BSL, and they are different from one language but similar to another.
Yeah.
So I understood how language works and what the structures are and how grammar in general works. So yes, definitely there are similarities.
Sure. Okay. So that leads us quite nicely into this section here about how you actually get into this career field. So my first question is, which subjects will I need at school or college? So someone who can speak a foreign language, is that a good starting point?
I think being able to speak a foreign language is useful in interpreting, because of course we also have deaf people whose first language isn't BSL or isn't English or they haven't grown up here. We have deaf refugees as well. We have deaf immigrants. We have deaf people with a heritage from a different culture. So there might be different languages being spoken or signed in the deaf family as well. So that's always helpful. It's not a necessity though. So you don't have to be able to learn, don't have to learn another language first. I think broad general knowledge is very important. So, reading the news, being kind of up to date with what's happening in the world. It doesn't really matter what specific subject you choose, but it will be that wherever your interests lie, whatever your favorite subjects are, is likely to be an area that you'll be very good at in interpreting. You might be interpreting in a secondary school, and then imagine you're interpreting math, but you're not really good at math and you're not understanding it, then you're going to struggle. So yeah, broad general knowledge, I would say, is important.
Sure. Okay. So talk us through the process that someone would follow from leaving school to actually becoming a professional BSL interpreter. What are the steps that you need to take and qualifications that you need?
Mm-hmm. There's a variety, well, mainly two routes, I would say. One is the university route, which is reasonably straightforward. As far as I know, there's only two undergraduate programs in the UK, which is the University of Wolverhampton or Harriet Watt in Scotland, where you can start from scratch, basically, and within 4 years, you can get to the point where you can get a qualification that will get you ready to become an interpreter. That doesn't necessarily mean you will already be one once you graduate, because there is two parts to it. You need to have the language, so you need a level 6 qualification in language, BSL, and you need a qualification in interpreting. And that then enables you to register as a trainee. And once you're a trainee, you then have to film yourself and put some evidence in, and there's some theory as well. And then you will have a supervisor who will make sure that while you're already working in some areas, that you can ask questions and be reassured, and they will assess you, and then you become a qualified interpreter. So this can be through the university route, or what used to be an NVQ route, but it's now a diploma.
Yeah,
which takes probably a little bit longer than university.
For sure. And how do people know that they either want to be an interpreter as a job and as a career, or how do they know if they'd be really good at it? Because there'll be people watching this at the moment who could be fantastic interpreters, but maybe you've never ever considered it before. So what are maybe those common traits and attributes that someone might have if they're going to be really good at this? So what would you, Christopher and Sarah, all have in common, for instance?
I think that's a very difficult question, because there is a vast amount of very, very good interpreters, and they're all very different. So I don't think it needs to be a specific type of person. I think you need to want to learn. You need to want to work with people. You need to have a bit of an understanding of how the world works, because that's often what you have to do, where somebody in an authority will explain a specific thing of how the world works. So it's about processing information and being able to use that information and turn it into a different language. Yeah, I think you need a little bit of resilience, because some situations can be difficult. You need a thick skin. But it's a very rewarding and very interesting and diverse job, I would say. It's for all kinds of people, all backgrounds. It's particularly, we want all backgrounds, because, of course, deaf people are also from all different backgrounds. And sometimes it's useful to be able to match that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
do you
anybody really?
Do you have to be a little bit extrovert to do this? Because by nature of what you're doing, you're kind of on display, just as Sarah and Christopher are at the moment. And I'm thinking, if you were interpreting for someone at perhaps a live audience event, though you might have your back to them, there's still hundreds or if not thousands of people kind of aware of you. So is it something that someone who's shy and introverted would steer away from?
It might be an area of work that someone who is introvert might stay away from. This is an area called performance interpreting. There is a whole industry around interpreters at Glastonbury, for example, interpreters on TV. which we've only just seen a prime example of at the coronation, where the interpreter got more praise than the concert itself. But you don't need to be extrovert to do this. You might be sitting in an office translating emails all day. You might be doing one-to-one things. And if introvert means that you are able to concentrate very well and focus on, because it's short bursts of energy that you need every time you're interpreting, that might work very well. I'm not the most extrovert myself, to be honest.
Yeah.
And when you're working, you don't see it as everybody's looking at me anymore. At the beginning, when you're training, yes, there is an element of, I have to stand up in front of everybody and say something, but you're not using your own words. I think that's an important part for people to realize. You don't have to be a good public speaker because it's not your words that are coming out of your mouth, it's somebody else's.
Sure. So from what you're saying is you're just really focused on the person that you are interpreting for, and if there's hundreds or thousands of people next to them, you're kind of ignoring them. You're channeling your efforts and focus into
that. Yeah, that's part of it. But the other part is I'm not just interpreting for a deaf person. I'm interpreting for everybody who's there.
Okay.
Because it's not just one direction. It's not just from English to BSL. It's also from BSL to English for deaf people, deaf professionals. There are now lots of deaf academics, teachers, scientists, engineers who I work for. But it's also, I am there because the hearing people can't use BSL.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. We've spoken about some of the perhaps emotional challenges of doing this role, but what about some of the physical challenges? I mean, I'm looking at Christopher at the moment, and I know Sarah has been interpreting you. Is it physically demanding on someone? Is there a certain amount of time that you wouldn't want to be interpreting beyond?
Yeah, so I mean, we have kind of rules or standards within the industry. So we try, as I said before, that there's kind of the 20-minute rule where you swap with somebody. Sometimes you might be working for longer. You might be in situations where the meeting goes on a bit longer than you expected and they didn't book a second interpreter. Those things happen. I don't think you can do full-time interpreting. You can't imagine it as being a 40-hour week of just waving your hands about. That's not what it is. Mm-hmm. I'd say it's half and half, or maybe 3/4 interpreting, and 1/4 is probably the paperwork, the business side of it. You have to write invoices, you have to chase invoices, you have to prepare, you have to travel to places. Often you might do 2 jobs in a day, but you might drive 200 miles. Yeah. Because the demand is so high. Sometimes the areas that we work in can kind of spread very widely.
Yeah. Okay. You spoke about the fact that you had your own personal experiences, and that's what got you into this as a career. And I'm sure that's the case with many of your colleagues as well, that they've got into it because of personal experiences, which I guess have provided you with some really rich real life experiences that have really helped you with your training. If someone's watching this and this is a career they really want to go into, but perhaps they haven't got a family member or friend that they've needed to interpret for, how can they go and gain some of those experiences just to find out whether this is something that they'd want to explore further?
Yeah. There's a lot of things you can do while you're learning BSL. And of course, you can start with a level 1 course at your local college. Many local colleges will have level 1 courses. Make sure you have a deaf tutor, so you learn the language from somebody who's a native user. And you can get to know some deaf people. I think that's the important thing. Just like with any other language, you want to get a little bit of immersion, and there's no deaf land that you can go to. So you might want to start volunteering with a local charity. So NDCS, for example, the National Deaf Children's Society, they have regional groups. They have opportunities where you can volunteer. I think in Hertfordshire, there is Heathland School, which is a deaf school. I'm sure they would be grateful if somebody rang and said, can I come and have a look? Of course, they can contact us at ASLI. So I'm the chair of the Association of Sign Language Interpreters. We have a regional network. If somebody emailed and said, I would really love to see an interpreter work, is there a way to do that? We would find a way to make that happen. Obviously, we can't take students into very private and confidential things, but there is always something that we could find where somebody can have a look and ask some questions. That's not a problem. And there are other charities as well that you can work with. And there might be a local deaf club. They are closing down, unfortunately, all over the country, just like many other social events where people come together. But there might be a local deaf club in your area as well.
Yeah, okay. We will share details of ASLI's website before we end the webinar. You mentioned Heathland School which is in Wheathampstead in Hertfordshire. There's also Knightsfield School in Welwyn Garden City. I'm sure the same would apply there. So finally, really, I want to find out from you the demand for interpreters, because you were fairly emphatic when we spoke originally that, wow, we need some interpreters in the industry. There's growing demand for it. So just explain to us a little bit about that and just kind of reassure people watching this at the moment that this is something you want to do. You're going to be in high demand.
Oh, yes. You are going to be in incredible demand from the day you start, basically. From the day you register, you will get emails and phone calls every day. There is too much work and not enough interpreters. For some numbers, there are probably around 150,000 BSL users in the UK. And I think the latest number is about 15 or 1600 interpreters in the country. So you can imagine that doesn't really work in the grand scheme of things. We do not have enough interpreters. Many of us are part-time as well, so I think that's important. It's a very flexible job. You might do one job in one day and none the next, and then you might be working for 7 days in a row. As you're freelance, that's your choice. So yeah, the demand is incredible. The pay is not too bad either. So I can absolutely recommend it as a career. It's a fantastic career.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's an important question. People always want to know, well, what do you actually get paid? Is it salary? Now, can you say roughly what would someone start with, or did it work on an hourly rate? Is it salary?
It's a very, very complicated question, and I can't give you exact numbers because it varies regionally where you are in the country. It varies on the job that you're doing. So if you're in an office translating emails, that will probably not be the same as if you're interpreting a lecture in a university. It might not be the same as if you're working in court. It's really, really very difficult. That's why I'm hesitating so much. But I think if you were employed, so there are some agencies who will have employed staff full-time, you're looking at something, depending on experience, between 30 and 45,000 a year, starting salary for quality. So the latest advert I saw was 30,000 for a trainee, and that's not for a qualified yet.
Okay, so compared to the national averages for someone who's coming in as a trainee in any industry, that's very competitive, and it reflects the supply and demand of interpreters. So yeah.
And then if you were freelance, you're probably looking at rates anything between 30 and 45 pounds an hour. And then you have certain rules. So in the industry standard is we have kind of a 3-hour minimum. Usually we charge in half days or full days. So even if I go to the GP for 10 minutes, I might still get paid for 3 hours work. Because the demand is so high, and because that means I can't then do another appointment because the timings won't fit.
Sure, okay. And that also reflects that preparation time and the post-appointment time that you've spoken about as well.
That's very important. So people need to be aware that you don't get paid just for the hours that you're doing while you're standing there voicing somebody or waving your hands about. It's also for sitting there writing your invoices and having meetings, tech meetings. A lot of stuff happens remote now. We do a lot of remote interpreting, as we can see right now. So you might have to check that the technology is working, that you have your camera and your headphones and everything.
Yeah,
that's all part of the job.
And the interpreters that we might see on the television, so you referenced the person who worked on the coronation at the weekend. Are they kind of like celebrity interpreters? Are they the people? Do you think interpreters aspire to be in those sorts of environments, or is that a very specialist type of interpreting?
It is a very specialist type of interpreting, particularly TV interpreting. I think you need to be a very experienced interpreter. It's an incredibly fast environment. There's no room for errors, really. And the same for performance interpreting. It's a niche job within our job. That's not what the majority of interpreters do. While, of course, that doesn't mean that you can't aspire to be one of those people. Especially on TV, we need more new talent, definitely. And I see Christopher is nodding because he's one of the TV interpreters that we see on the news every day.
So he is one of those. He is one of our celebrity interpreters.
Yes, he is one of the celebrities, but also just a very experienced interpreter. And you can only do. There are some jobs that you can only do if you've been in the business for a long time, I think.
Okay.
So you need to just be aware of that. But that doesn't mean that you can't do fun things. I qualified in 2018, and in 2019 I interpreted for the NAC for the Star Trek convention.
Okay.
Because I'm a Star Trek fan and I kind of knew what was going to come up, so I was okay with that. And met Captain Picard, and I thought that was quite cool. So that doesn't mean that you can't do fun things, but it might not be on TV in your first year of interpreting.
Yeah. Okay. Now, of course, the industry wants to keep hold of all of its talent, but I always ask this question on all of these webinars. Is there a natural career progression outside of BSL interpreting that professionals might go into or tend to go into?
I think it's the other way around. Often in our profession, people come from other professions and from other areas, or they work their way up. So BSL interpreting is kind of often the next stage of their career. People will become communication support workers, so they work in colleges or schools, maybe work with deaf children often. Or they might be working in a charity and then become the booking coordinator for a local agency and learn how bookings are made and how people are referred, for example. And then they start their journey to become an interpreter. However, there are also then interpreters who will go on and get additional qualifications and do even more. So quite a lot of interpreters now have psychology degrees. They will become counselors, psychotherapists, because obviously deaf people also need that kind of service, and it's much easier to do that in a direct way if they don't need an interpreter for that, because it's a very private and very confidential situation.
Yeah.
Yeah, or people become teachers of the deaf, for example. That happens as well.
Yeah.
Or lecturers, university lecturers.
For sure. And I suppose whilst we need more and more people in the industry, there's also therefore that demand to have more teachers and lecturers to help train them and progress them through the system.
Yes.
As well. Yeah.
Yes.
We always like to make these webinars Hertfordshire centric because the majority of our audience are going to be from schools in Hertfordshire. I mean, it sounds from everything that you're saying is that this isn't just a Hertfordshire challenge to get more interpreters. This is on a national level, but specifically to Hertfordshire, are there any particular demands? Is the fact that we're closer to London, does that tend to be an employment hub that's going to benefit someone in the county?
Yes. So the deaf communities tend to polarize around deaf schools. So where there are deaf schools, there are also many deaf people. I live near Derby, where we have the second biggest deaf community outside of London. You are quite close to London, so it's a great opportunity for people to become interpreters that can travel into London. They will drown in work. They literally will get so many requests. It's a great place to be to become an interpreter. Look, from even traveling and all of those things. It's amazing. Definitely become an interpreter, please.
Brilliant. Look, before we go, I just want to give you the opportunity, Jenny, to explain to people where they might want to go to find out more information. So you've given me details of the ASLI website, and the QR code underneath that would take you directly through to their website. What sort of information could someone find out on there?
So we are the Professional Membership Association, which means we provide training for our members, best practice guidelines. We also have a page on how to become an interpreter, just in a very brief format. And I think for young people who are thinking about this career, it could just be an email to the board saying, I would be really interested, and can you tell me some more, and can you put me in touch with somebody? So that's more kind of a networking element of it. If people want to know more about the qualification, they should have a look at the Signature website, which gives you all the different places that you can go on courses for, because you need your BSL level 1, 2, 3, and then 6. Obviously, the two universities that I mentioned, University of Wolverhampton and Harriet Watt, they will give more information. And if you email the course leaders, they will be more than happy to tell you more about that. And then there are all the deaf charities. So NDCS, for example, the Royal Association for Deaf People, RAD, might be of interest. And also our regulator. So we have a voluntary regulator, so we get a license to interpret. That's the NLCPD. They give some more information on qualifications and what you need to register as well.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. I think really just in closing, if I could ask you just for some closing thoughts, Jenny. So anyone who's watching this at the moment, what would you say to really just to inspire them that this is a fantastic career for them to go into?
If you think about all the things you would never normally get to see, all the behind the scenes, if you're thinking about, oh, I would really like to be a doctor or a nurse or a lawyer or an engineer, but maybe you don't have the skills, or you maybe you can't for whatever personal circumstances. As an interpreter, you might get to see all of those areas. Interpreters are very nosy people. They are very, very interested in everything that happens around them. And you learn so much about the world and about people. You see so many different things. The experiences you gain over time are absolutely amazing. And the reward for all of it is the trust that you get from your clients. Because if you're doing a good job, you will get booked again, and they will trust you to represent them. That's the important bit. You're representing other people the whole time. You are someone else's voice or someone else's hands.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, Jenny, it's been absolutely fabulous hearing from you this afternoon. Really, really inspirational. I mean, equally, let me just extend that to Christopher and to Sarah as well. So we've actually got to see live somebody fulfilling these fantastic roles that we've been talking about. So my gratitude both to Christopher and to Sarah for giving up their time. I'm conscious, Jenny, you said that normally for about 20 minutes is the amount of time they'd want to do it, and we've been going for nearly double that. So thank you to Christopher and Sarah for their time as well. For those of you that are watching, we hope that you will make yourself familiar with the HOP website. Here's the screen again with our social media handles. If you have a look on those, you'll find that you'll find all the previous videos that we've recorded. We've covered about 70 different career areas over the last few years, real variety of them as well. Even this term, we've done careers as cabin crew, we've done careers as a pharmacist. Next year, it'll be careers in the ambulance service. So there's something in there for everyone. So if you've had a look at it, also share it with your family and friends as well. Hopefully they will find some inspiration, some really good information in there as well. Thank you to everyone for watching the webinar today. So we really hope you found it really informative, and we wish you the very best of luck in your future career steps.
Thank you.